Welcome everyone to Dr. John Bedker's Leadership Podcast, the podcast focused on leadership. The episode will begin shortly. Thank you so much for tuning in. Enjoy the podcast.
Welcome everyone. Thank you so much for tuning in to the Dr. John Bedker Leadership Podcast. I'm your host, John Bedker. Well, this is the Labor Day edition of our podcast, and I want to start first and foremost by saying Happy Labor Day to all the workers who are out there creating goods and services, making our economy work. Without workers, we are literally nothing. They make the products, they deliver the goods, they deliver the services. Workers are not only key, they are critical. Without workers, our economy does not function. There is a large tension between work and workers and the future of work and workers. I'll get into that more here shortly. But it's the tension between those people that do the work, that create the products, deliver the goods, deliver the services, and shareholders. People that own stock in these companies, have ownership in these companies, and what their role can and should be. Are they effectively the overlord? Is their need far greater, or at least somewhat greater, than the worker? Who do we pay homage to? Who do we give thanks to? Well, certainly businesses need capital, for sure. But what about the worker? Well, we're going to talk about that. And I think it's important because we are at a point in the United States today where celebrating Labor Day is really an anachronism, a thing of the past. Labor today is not in a good place. I'm going to read from a series of articles, and I'm only going to read snippets of them. There are just so many things that could be said about work and labor, and it's important. I think it's hugely important, particularly for leaders, as they understand those they serve and those that serve the companies that employ them. But that relationship, frankly, has been and is today, on Labor Day, quite tenuous. Let me begin by an article by Mark Wiesbrook. He is with the Seattle Times. Article is dated August 31, 2025. Again, the Seattle Times opinion piece. The title is called Trump's Extreme Anti-Labor Policies Could Determine the Effect of AI on Jobs. Well, let's think about now this changing world we're living in. Talking about robotics, talking about technology, AI, as this article I'm going to read from discusses. Is it the end of workers? There's a fear about that, perhaps rightly so. But what do we know historically? Well, I'm going to quote some figures here in just a moment, but what we know is that any number of advances have not led to the demise of work or workers. In fact, work and workers have grown. And through these resources, so has their productivity. Okay, from this article by Mark Wiesbrook. What will be the effect of artificial intelligence on labor in the United States? The current government's agenda for labor will undoubtedly have an influence here. Last year, President Donald Trump praised Elon Musk lavishly for telling his workers that he would fire them if they went on strike. Quote, "You're the greatest," end quote, President Trump said. This is reminiscent of the opening salvo in the unprecedented attack on labor launched by President Ronald Reagan back in 1981. He fired 11,000 air traffic controllers who had gone on strike. This assault jump-started a steady and accelerated erosion of the rights of workers to organize, to form unions, and to bargain collectively under the law. Now, we're very clear about the rights of shareholders, stockholders. We're very clear about the rights of bondholders. So debt and equity, boy, do they have a voice. Do they have representation? And is it heard? Yeah. And it has for a very long time. What about workers? Well, historically, yes. This notion that I've mentioned many times, and I think as leaders we all need to be embracing, and that is this notion that a rising tide does in fact raise all boats. So, if you take care of your workers, you raise their tide, so to speak, it's going to raise the tide of that company and the shareholders. But if it's an adversarial relationship, if it's contentious, if it's I own the company, shareholder, and my priority is to make money. And I'm going to accomplish that by giving as little as possible to labor, to being not just reluctant, but defiant to work with them. I will see them as adversary. And that's a problem. So, this assault has been steady and accelerated. Trump now is aiming to continue this. Amazingly, on August the 19th, a Republican-appointed Court of Appeals for the Fifth Circuit decided that the structure of the National Labor Relations Board, that's the NLRB, was likely unconstitutional. In doing this, the court decided in favor of Elon Musk's SpaceX and two other companies. The board of the NLRB has been rendered powerless because Trump fired the board chair. Her name, Gwen Wilcox, did so illegally, but nonetheless she's gone, leaving it with two members, which is to say less than a quorum. In another unprecedented attack on organized labor, Trump canceled union contracts for 400,000 federal workers in August. Again, more about that here shortly. So this is the environment where we have to consider, well, what are the prospects for AI entering into our world? And what will its impact be on work and workers? Okay, well, it would seem logically that AI would reduce the need for workers, although we don't know that. Again, the example of doing away with the typewriter, did that lead to word processing? Yeah. Did it lead to more jobs, more word processing over time? Yes. Will we find similar ways to navigate these advancements in AI? We don't know. But is it possible that the nature of work, the definition of work, the management of this work might lead to perhaps new and different, but increased employments, perhaps of a very different nature? We don't know. Let's talk about economic history here just quickly. What does it show us? It shows that it doesn't always work that this output per hour of labor is the basis of rising living standards, that productivity advances may not be occurring and may not continue to occur. Let's talk about this history. From 1948 to 1979, productivity rose by 122%. Labor compensation for the typical worker, mostly followed, increased by 95%. So a little bit less, but in the game, making advances. Then we entered this new era. From 1979 to today, 2025, productivity grew by 86%. However, the typical worker got far less, with an hourly pay raise of only 32%. So you can see this tide changing. Why? Because they're facing a regime that is so much more anti-labor than those before that it's not a good sign for this distribution of gains from AI productivity going forward. So neither are reports of corruption, right? As a leader, don't we live in this world of doing the right thing, of gaining trust because of our trustworthy behavior? Let's talk about corruption. The opposite, right? No other U.S. president has ever used the office to generate billions of dollars in personal wealth while in power. And his contempt for working people is coming out of Trump's one big, beautiful bill. What can you say? This is a quote from this article in the Seattle Times. What can you say about a regime that takes away health care, Medicaid, from more than 11 million people, cuts food assistance for 22 million people, saddles working people with thousands of dollars per family annually in payments for tariffs, while including trillions, yeah, that's right, trillions of dollars in tax cuts for the rich over the next decade. So it is a new landscape. Two more articles I want to touch upon. One is an article by Eileen Sullivan. She's reported here on September 1st about Trump orders having stripped away nearly 500,000 federal workers of their union rights. Eileen Sullivan, quoting her, more than 445,000 federal employees saw their union protections disappear in August. Agencies moved to comply with an executive order President Trump signed earlier this year that called for ignoring collective bargaining contracts with nearly 1 million workers. Not negotiating, just ignoring. The termination of protections followed an August 1 appeals court ruling on challenges to Mr. Trump's directive. The order, signed in late March, directed 22 agencies to, in fact, ignore contracts for employees in specific unions. Last Thursday, Mr. Trump signed a second executive order stripping union rights from thousands of other employees at 6 additional agencies. So, folks, on this Labor Day, what we're talking about is an incredible threat to working people. Back to the article. Mr. Trump said that the affected workers had roles that touched on national security, that provisions in their labor contracts could interfere with his policies being carried out. He cited, for example, the role of the Department of Veteran Affairs employees, the role they play in providing care for wounded troops in wartime. Federal labor unions targeted in this executive order have repeatedly sued the Trump administration and in some cases forced the administration to temporarily pause the president's effort to shrink the federal workforce and reshape the government. The American Federation of Government Employees, the AFGE, has filed more than a dozen lawsuits related to the federal workforce. The White House has likened this to a, quote, declaration of war. Wow. So far, 9 agencies have terminated union contracts that covered more than, as I've mentioned, 445,000 federal workers and a broad range of agencies. Here's a quote from this article, and I'll move right on. This is literally the largest act of union busting in American history, said Mike Podhorzer, a former political director of the AFL-CIO, a labor union. There's not another time when that many people lost their union. So for most of the federal workers who've lost their bargaining rights recently, their unions can no longer fight agencies over contract violations. For example, unions have been fighting with Mr. Trump's executive order from earlier this year, calling that the federal employees to work in government offices, even when they were hired, now this is specifically hired as a remote worker, or had that flexibility negotiated in their union contract. These stories go on and on and on, and what they tell is a tale of anti-labor, anti-worker. It is an authoritarian playbook being played out. Workers of all kinds of agencies, all purposes of work, very few left untouched, and under this auspices of the name of security. Well, one labor group involves janitorial services, people that in the nighttime clean government offices, so the next day the people can come to a clean and crisp office. Now, what that has to do with national security, these cleaners have no idea. The idea that they are somehow connected to national security seems, let's be honest, ludicrous. But nonetheless, they've been excluded from their union contracts. They've been absolutely not allowed to bargain collectively, to redress grievances, and frankly, have felt a need to be quiet in fear of losing their job altogether. In a quote from this article, inspectors are very reluctant to bring things to a supervisor's attention in fear for their jobs. So that could mean unsafe consumer products end up being sold to the public. Now that story, folks, comes from inspectors at the Agriculture Department, Food Safety and Inspection Division, because they no longer have a process to raise safety concerns about the products without facing retaliation. Now again, how these people are directly related to national security, which is what President Trump is using as his vehicle to cancel union contracts, nobody actually knows. We see this with wide job cutbacks in the Veterans Administration. And in many, many places, but just a quick highlight, nurses, right? So now that nurses in the VA have had their contracts canceled and they've been working without contracts, spokesperson Irma Westmoreland, a nurse at the Veterans Medical Center in Augusta, she's also the chair of the National Nurses United's VA Veterans Affairs Division. This year, patient care problems related to staffing shortages have been on the rise because of the Trump administration's effort to shrink the federal workforce, Ms. Westmoreland said. Nurses continue to document concerns, but agency managers have not been as responsive because they no longer have to be. So what happens? Well, solving problems does not occur. And think about that in a patient care environment. Okay, not so good. All right, last article I want to touch on just quickly and briefly is a guest essay in the Times dated September 1st. It's by Eric Loomis. He's a historian of labor. He writes extensively about unions, politics, and workers. I believe he's at the University of Rhode Island. He says this is a most unfortunate Labor Day for labor. The labor movement has taken it on the chin repeatedly in the last several decades, but President Trump is the most ruthlessly anti-labor president since before the Great Depression. If the labor movement does not fight harder than it has since Mr. Trump regained the presidency, its future will be dire. Mr. Trump and his administration have unilaterally stripped collective bargaining rights from hundreds of thousands of federal workers. And again, I've detailed that, some 445,000 already. Well, despite this assault, we've really only touched the very, very surface. But what about unions? What are they doing? Union leaders, right? There's a podcast about leadership. What are union leaders doing? Where's organized labor in the public fight to maintain union jobs, to stop the stripping of the safety net, and lead the fight for democracy? Other than some statements and angry speeches, the movement has been muted. Okay. Are there things that can be done? Absolutely. Are there things that should be done? Absolutely. Is Labor Day not a very good time to think about those things and to act on those things, to develop that plan of action, that call to action? And the answer is emphatically yes. Leaders of labor unions and, frankly, managers of corporations, businesses, institutions, any and all people who work with, for, and serve workers should take this to heart. Why? Because the rising tide does in fact raise all boats, folks. Taking care of those that do the work means that the productivity and the profitability of a corporation will also rise. The idea that putting a hole in someone's boat to sink it is just going to raise your boat and sink theirs is a foolhardy leadership notion. A leader has to be very, very clear. We are here to serve, to work with, not against, workers. All right. I wish it was a really happy Labor Day, folks. I think it could be someday. I really do. I believe that. I do have hope about that. But this Labor Day and the onslaught of these executive orders by President Trump, and frankly, the silence of labor unions, their leadership, really causes me to make that point here in the podcast, this episode. Leaders, stand up, speak out, develop a plan. This is a call to action for workers. All right, everybody. Thank you so much. I really appreciate you tuning in. Take care. We'll talk soon.
Thank you for tuning in to Dr. John Bedker's Leadership Podcast. We hope you enjoyed this episode. Please tell your friends, and, of course, please follow our podcast and subscribe. Thank you again for tuning in.